Howdy YouTube, it is Coffee Talk with Haze, episode 15. Today I want to talk about the ground, earth, zero potential, all that good stuff. I tried to do this last week. I tried to present an episode for you. I had a big stack of books that I was going to go through and kind of quote various things that I had highlighted, and it just didn't work out. That kind of format would be much better if I had like OBS and an overlay and just show you a digital format of all that text instead. Not that I was trying to show it, it took too long for me to go through. So today it's just going to all be up here. You're just going to have to take my word that I'm telling you the truth, I guess. Faith-based technology, sharing, disinformation. Good coffee still. Cafe Bustelo. Alright, it's been a busy past 7 days for me, folks. Been a lot going on here. So, I guess we'll go way back to the 1800s, in the days of telegraphy, when Morse code was the new thing, the new language, and people were spreading wires all across this land and maybe your land to send communications very, very far distances, much faster than a horse could travel letters. And this was probably discovered long before we were doing that, but a lot of these discoveries were developed when we were actually fleshing this stuff out. Sending these cable lines, these conductors, miles and miles and miles. Well, not miles, but long distances. Long enough to start experiencing a lot of weird anomalies and phenomena that were not good. So along somewhere the way, somebody figured out that the ground itself acts as a circuit return. In other words, I could have a Morse code sending telegraph device hooked up at one station, and have its, how do I say it, it's the portion of the current that it's bleeding off from its power, and just shunt that to ground. That means to just send it straight to ground when we're done with it. And this is what's necessary to complete a circuit. We'll get to that in a little while. Sorry, this is a little chicken and the egg, unfortunately. It has to be. This is why it's so hard for people to explain this, right? And then you've got another telegraph station over here, two telegraph stations. And it was discovered, or maybe even known when they were built back in the 1800s, that all we needed to do was just have ground spikes, and when I send a wire from one to the other to cause a remote action to fire off, essentially, the current's going to return through the earth. This is a very fascinating phenomenon. And of course, this is where we started getting the idea of calling everything earth. Now, where things start to get really confusing is like when you look at your 9-volt battery. And by the way, this is a battery by the very definition of the word. It contains cells on the inside. It's got a positive and a negative terminal. And this is where a lot of the confusion creeps in, because of this negative and positive kind of notion. Really what the negative is trying to tell us is that that's zero. But it's very convenient to have a positive, because in this case this is a 9-volt battery. But if it were a 1.5 cell, for every such cell or battery there would be a need to put the number here, which might not be a bad thing actually. But no, we use a positive and a negative. And I think the reason for that is because we just want to have like a stark contrast. Zero is very neutral. You see, it's not like, hey, black and white, hot and cold, right? It's not stark, it's not alerting. Having this negative and positive, this strict dichotomy, it's like they oppose each other, right? So it's hey, there's something going on here. It gives us an indication. It tells us what's going on. Because if you think about it, we're almost like infants. Even though we have high educations, we use all this technology without understanding how any of it works. We're really just babies in a candy store, all right, until we understand how this works. So the powers that be, so that we don't shock and hurt ourselves, gives us indications. They give us indicators to help us spread the gospel along to the other fledgling young ones who don't necessarily learn this stuff. It's the blind teaching the blind a lot of times. But let's keep moving on. Sorry, this is a very, very easy path to get off the beaten path. Now, back in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, we had two kind of classifications for circuits: earth circuits and metallic circuits. So the earth circuits were the things like the telegraph, and I think starting to get into the telephone itself, sending long distance transmissions, and radio, of course. where we could use the ground to create the circuit that's necessary for current to flow. The other type of circuit was called metallic circuit, and that's what we deal with today. Like the camera that I'm using, even this battery pack in it has more than just cells inside of it. There's circuitry, of course, not just for the digital readout, but to sense over current and to sense other things to make sure that it's well protected. And also to know, not to drain too much. There's also a flashlight on this thing. So all of that has circuitry. They would call that a metallic circuit back in those days. So now this is where things get kind of interesting, because I wanted to say this for later, but I'm going to have to talk about interconnectivity next, because this is where we really started to understand more about grounding concepts, I believe. Because really, there's only two reasons why we need grounding. There's really only two reasons why we need grounding at all. Now back up for a second. Having said that, every circuit has to be complete. So think of it this way: the circuit starts, it's like a circle, right? And when it comes back around, when it's done doing all of that work, at the end of the day, before it comes back to whatever it joins, it's where things get really, really interesting. It's at zero. It's expended all of its energy. You could think of it that way. It's a little confusing because current is still flowing. It just doesn't have any energy more, and it's what we say is now at zero potential or ground potential. It's definitely not at a negative potential. It may be more negative in reference to something else, but no, at the end of that, where it's coming back into this, in this particular case especially, it's going to be 0 volts. So having just gotten that out of the way, right? So that has nothing to do with grounding per se. So we only need to do grounding for two reasons. The first one is for safety. And that really is the primary core reason for all of your household electronics, for grounding all of that kind of stuff. Definitely safety. The second reason is devoted primarily to you, the sound enthusiast, the audiophile, the home engineer, the home producer, and that is eliminating unwanted noise, like that air conditioner that just kicked on. So noise is not always bad, right? The cicadas that we were listening to earlier, we've got some other bugs out here and some birds. That's kind of a musical noise in a sense. Noise is a very hard thing to classify. But in the case of why we want to use grounding, that kind of noise is definitely not wanted. It's a horrible sound, and you don't want it in your mix at all. And that is the primary reasons for grounding. It's really just that simple. So it gets interesting though, like I've got a few things like props out here. This is a TS 1/4 inch jack. Tip, sleeve, that's what the TS stands for. You're used to seeing these like thusly, just as a cable. This is an 1/8 inch, pardon me for using non-metric. This is a TRS, tip ring sleeve. So you're used to just seeing the outer edge, and you just see these little 3 things and these 2 black bands. It's easy to look at this if you didn't know any better and to think that the black bands are what's sort of carrying the information. Probably not, but don't be surprised that somebody might think that. Don't chastise them for that, because, it's not until you open it up, and we're all not brave enough to open things up. I wasn't for the longest time. That you understand how this is actually starting to be connected. And what we see is that this whole piece right here is all connected together. And there's this little tiny eyelet where I could solder a wire onto. And it's pretty much the same. For the 1/4 inch version, here's a 1/4 inch TS jack. Kind of the same thing. And look, that little eyelet and everything else is really no bigger. And the wires going through the cable, I could use the same spool of cable for both of these. So I just wanted to dispel one quick myth in that mini jacks are sonically inferior to 1/4 inch jacks. That's utterly ridiculous. It has more to do with the actual jack itself, not the connector, but the jack. So, how is the jack connected to the circuit? And these are what we would call panel mounted. So they're fastened onto the case itself, which I'll get to in a moment. And that way they're secure. So when you plug jacks in and out, you're not worried about losing their connection, as opposed to what we deal with a lot these days. Like, for example, these USB jacks are all what we call PCB mounted. They are mounted to the printed circuit board. So you don't want to wiggle them out with a lot of force because you will damage them. Whereas opposed to things that are mounted to the case can take a lot more force without breaking. So in each one of these, for grounding, what we're going to do is we're going to designate one of the conductors to ground. I'm getting ahead of myself though. Let's back up. Let's back up. Let's talk about grounding for safety first. So there's a lot of misunderstanding in how this works. When you see a lot of books, like I've got some pretty cool books that are devoted to physics and some other kind of light stuff. They've actually got whole chapters on electronics and electricity, and it's great to read all of that from a very core kind of perspective. And oh, that's Ruby over there scratching on her post. That's so cute. So one of the things they always want to talk about is safety, but they never really talk about much about the actual electrician's workflow, or like, well, what am I trying to say? Signal flow, if you will. So there's a breaker box in your home where when you look outside, all of the wires coming off the electrical poles coming in, they hit some breaker box at some point. It's called a breaker box for a reason, because we want to be able to break the circuit. Now, way back in the day, not too terribly way back, but back, in the 70s, it was still very common for residential wiring in my country to be only two-prong. So here I have a three-prong electrical jack, but back in the day, we only accepted really just the two. One's a hot, one's a neutral. I'm not going to get into that too much, but the important thing there is that that's your circuit completion. You can think of it as a current flowing from the hot to the neutral. Doesn't really matter. The neutral is at zero. It's at ground potential. So really, again, that's all we needed to complete the circuit, and that's all you found in a lot of homes. At some point, people started figuring out it might be better to have a separate ground. What was going on is we were sharing the so-called negative terminal, and we were designating it as ground also. Ground is a safety. What happens when lightning hits your I keep wanting to say telephone line, your electrical wires, your electrical pole? That energy could be transmitted across the wires. Now, you may not believe what I'm about to tell you, but it is the absolute truth. Way back in the day, this was the early 80s, and I was a child, and I was at a friend's house. In fact, just a few blocks from where we are right now. And his old home, this is a nice little home where his father and he lived with his father and his brother. And I can tell you right now, there were no grounded outlets in that house. We were watching television in the living room, and a flash storm, kind of a freak storm, came through, which is kind of common for this area because we're kind of in a swampy area here. And lightning actually went through the house, hit the TV set, and blew it up right there in front of our eyes. We were lucky that we were way away from the TV set. I mean, the glass didn't outwardly blow, it sort of imploded. That's really what happened. Scared the crap out of us. But I remember reading in a Time magazine book from the 70s, it was like a compendium, one of those things where they compile a bunch of the stuff together and sell it as a special kind of thing for their subscribers. This came out about 1979, and I was reading in the back of it where it actually talked about that. It said, yes, your television set could actually blow up. And I thought, okay, thank goodness that somebody's actually documented that, because I've told this story before, and so I don't think that everybody believes me when I tell this story. Okay, so, hey, exploding television sets. Now keep in mind, this was a cathode ray tube, you know, the big giant tube things that probably cause cancer. And yeah, we don't use those anymore for a number of reasons, probably because they cause cancer. Main other two reasons being because, one, you know, hey, they can explode, and they were heavy, man. Those things were just ridiculous to have to move around, just ridiculous. So at some point, people started running a separate ground wire. I don't know how they knew to think this thought, but they did. They thought, you know, it's a couple things that we understand. Now, I don't want to get too much into series and parallel circuits right now, but suffice to say that when you connect something up in series, you've got an input and an output, and for series, you take one output to another input, and then the next output to the next input, and so forth. And in parallel, all of your inputs are connected and all of your outputs are connected. So, especially way back in the day, most of the cases were metal. We'll get into why this is plastic and not metal. That's something that's kind of metal-ish. But, you know, metal was more readily able to be produced back then. Plastic is much more readily able to be produced, especially with 3D printers. But we still have a lot of metal enclosures out there that we use, guitar pedals especially. And a lot of high-end audio will shield everything in metal. So a great side effect of that, I guess, is that we can actually attach the metal encasing of our electronic device to ground. And this does two things for us, both involved with safety. The first thing it does is that it takes us out of being in series with the case. It puts us into being in parallel with the case. Why does this matter? Well, it doesn't. But what if, see, this is the thing why all of this is so hard to explain to somebody. What if something went wrong? See, that's the thing, is like under most circumstances, everything is operating correctly. We don't have these bad situations, so it's hard to teach this stuff because you've actually got to present a bad situation. It's kind of hard to do. So it is possible for the power, right, coming into this circuit. See, it's in this nice protective wire and this nice protective casing right here where it's plugging into, but somewhere inside of this case, like here for example, we've got wires that are going to be coming out of this going to the circuit. And those wires are going to be insulated, but what if the insulation, for whatever reason, wears off, and now the hot wire just happens to be touching the case? It's a total arbitrary situation, but it's actually happened in the past. In fact, I lost a dear friend to this when I was a teenager. She was at a swimming pool where she was a lifeguard, and she was drying her hair in the bathroom, and she was electrocuted. It devastated us. It devastated us. It's okay now. I don't need sympathy right now, but the point is that this is real, folks. I mean, this is a real thing. Safety is very important with this stuff. It's very dangerous, especially when in the presence of water. And hopefully I'm going to remember to get to that down the line. So we've got a hot wire coming out of this, and now it's rubbed off and it's touching the outer, the metal case of our enclosure. If we touch that, and we're also touching ground, well, that hot, right? We've acted, you know, it's almost the same as us taking our finger and bridging the gap right there between it. It's actually a little bit worse, because in this case, if I did it with my finger, you've got to imagine where I'm touching it here to where I'm touching it here. That's really the extent of where the current is only going to go. This is why it's always important when you're dealing with this stuff to have one hand in your pocket, behind your back, sitting on it, tied behind your back, so that if you do grab something, the current isn't going to flow through your body. But in the case of my friend, she's got a hairdryer, and the current went through her body, probably across her heart, and, you know, down to the ground. We presume she was standing in a puddle of water, possibly. I mean, you know, yeah. There's a lot of other stories out there about people being electrocuted using their phone chargers. Yeah, don't charge your phone and be in the bathtub listening to music or your cell phone, that kind of stuff. But it's happened. Okay, so now, by actually wiring our enclosure to ground, by connecting the enclosure itself to ground, always. All right, now, when I cross these two bridges with my finger, I'm really crossing all three. That's the beauty of this. This does two things. One, it takes me out of series and puts me in parallel with the current. So now, imagine a branching tree, or like your family tree, right? The current's going to go through and it's going to branch off and it's going to hit all of these other, it's going to equal out and spread out. Not quite equally, but it's going to spread out. And that's the important thing is that now much less current will be flowing through me. But here's the even better part. Here's the brilliant part. Because we're dealing with mains voltage and with a properly wired electrical system in your home, right, that's been rated, or whatever that word is that I can't think of right now while I'm stuttering. You know, it goes by code, spec, whatever that is. I can't remember the word, whatever. Anyways, there's a breaker box. So now, when I touch this, the current is actually going to short out between hot and ground. And this is beautiful. And I can't go into the details for this, but it's going to be more than the breaker that is set up in your breaker box is rated to handle. And that's going to cause the breaker to flip and turn off the electricity. So when people say that, you know, makes it safe to touch the offending device again, well, the reason why it's safe to touch the device is because the electricity is now off. That's the part I found that they don't really tell you. So yes, you are in parallel, and a lot of the current gets shunted to ground through the other way, as opposed to just you. But more importantly, all that rush of current is going to flip the breaker, cutting off the electricity altogether. Right? This is beautiful. So I hope that makes sense. There's a lot more that I want to talk about, but I don't have the confidence to talk about like a whole lot of stuff. Like, for example, you know, what if you're in your car and the electrical line lands on your car, right? Now you've got 120 volts hitting in your car and you're insulated by the tires, you know? So, see, that kind of stuff I'm not comfortable talking about with right now because, you know, I don't want to give false information, especially involving this stuff, because it's very, very, very important. We're out of coffee, so we got to move on. So let's talk about noise. Now, how does this work? This again, this is really, really good. This works by the one thing that I don't really have here. Well, I do have here. By cables. So before I talk about that, I want to talk about one of my favorite books. It's called The Art of Electronics by Horowitz and Hill. It's way up here. Let me tell you, it's a hard read, but when you can, you know, there's a lot of gold to be sifted out of that book. It's only 1,000-something pages too, so it's pretty short. One of the things that I read was on ground loops, and what they're telling circuit designers in that book for what they're dealing with, and this is more than, you know, this is circuit designing for radio frequencies, microwaves, x-rays, you know, all kinds of stuff. Is basically, don't worry about ground loops. As a circuit designer, don't worry about introducing ground loops. In fact, introduce more ground loops. As many ground loops as possible. And it literally says at the little end of that paragraph that ground loop and noise issues, that's an audio thing. Don't worry about it, essentially. Now, not really quite fair, and we're not really comparing apples and oranges. Not because we're talking about two different industries, you know, like say X-ray circuit designers versus console circuit designers. Horowitz and Hill, they're talking about circuit design, right? They're talking about what's inside the case. When we're talking about eliminating ground loop noises and hums, we're dealing with interconnectivity issues, hooking up one device to another. And the magic really lies in here, in the cable itself, and how it's wired to our connectors, as I've shown you before, and something that you may have heard of called common mode rejection, which I'm not going to talk about in this at all. That's for another day. But suffice to say that if you think that common mode rejection is very, very complicated and very high level and just involves a lot of rocket science, it don't. It's very, very simple. It's used all the time. So I have here a DC jack. Now you see these on the outside all the time, but you don't really much see them on the back. And here you see, once again, 3 wires. Now this is not the same thing as our AC, wall outlet, 120 mains voltage kind of thing. Not at all. These little guys are more akin to these jacks, okay? I hate to say it that way, sorry, but yeah. I'm trying to make sure you're paying attention right now, I guess is what I'm saying. So when you see these little 3 prongs on a DC jack, one of these is a switch. Yeah. There's a built-in switch inside of all of these, and that had me confused for the longest time. And guess what? There's a built-in switch inside of this, and there's a built-in switch inside of this. This allows us to do neat tricks that are out of the scope of this. But, okay, moving forward. So, what's very interesting is that when you wire your cables, you're inevitably going to wire, in this case, this is just a TS, so it's a mono signal. We have 2 conductors, however. We still need 2 conductors. That's the thing that I think I'm trying to really convey right now, is that whenever you interconnect these devices, whenever you plug your guitar into an amp, whenever you plug your synthesizer into a guitar pedal, whenever you plug the clock CV output of your TB303 into, let's back that up, whenever you take the trig out of your SH101 into your clock of your TR808, right? You're interconnecting those 2 devices. You're making a circuit. And in all of those cases, we use the return, what we would kind of consider neutral, as ground. Because the one thing that we haven't really discussed yet, right, the elephant in the room, is this. Okay, so all of these AC circuits, they all have 3 prongs, DC don't. The DC jacks, and I didn't bring a DC wall wart out here with me, sorry, but they don't. They just have 2. Think about that for a second, all right? So in my apartment, I have 6 wall outlets that I can use right now. Only 2 of them are grounded. That was the horror of my first discovery when I got my apartment, was, oh no, am I going to be able to set my music studio up in here? What's going to happen? Should I use ungrounded outlets for my studio? The answer is no. What I have done is I've run extension cables from my grounded outlets all the way to where I need them, and I've done so in a way that I'm trying to distribute the amps accordingly. Now, all of your power outlets, your wall warts, or your strips, or whatever you want to call them, and your extension cords, they're pretty much all rated for 15 amps. So that's what you got right there. So for any given wall outlet, you've got pretty much 15 amps-ish. Maybe 15 per. You've got 2 eyelets there, but they're both connected together. They're always connected together. And for that matter, the ones across the wall are probably connected together too. Maybe they're going to another breaker slot on your breaker box. If they are, then you can put more amps into it that way. My concern right now is that I don't want to run my soldering iron and my oscilloscope and all my electronic station off that same outlet that I'm running my music synthesizers, my music studio off of, my console and my computer. So I run that and my air conditioner from the one out of my bathroom. It just works out that way. So this way, when the air conditioner kicks on and off, there's no surging happening, any lights or anything else like that that's going on the other half. So that's pretty cool. But again, going back to my experience with seeing that lightning come through that house and hitting that television, when we get some lightning storms around here, I think it's very important to ground your devices for safety. Mainly for their safety, not your safety. All of that's pretty much provided for and taken care of, especially when you're dealing with DC powered devices. Later I'll talk about the difference between AC and DC powered devices. We're talking mainly about ground right now. But unfortunately, you have to talk about the other to talk about the one. So, but in terms of noise, no, there's really no, grounding is not going to eliminate the noise. Grounding is not going to eliminate the noise. Now, however, poor grounding will most definitely introduce noise into the system. So, I don't know how I would be doing that in my apartment. It's kind of hard to do. It really is. Like, in other words, I would need to have some other power source coming in and then integrate that, interface that with my system and then whatever power source, and they would not be grounded together, and that might cause problems. Why would I do that, right? So and why would you do that? So for the most part, everything that you're using is coming out of the same ground potential. So everything's going to be it's going to be grounded right off the bat. Now, I have a number of devices that are battery powered, right? And those hook up just fine. In fact, you find that when you're not grounded necessarily that way through the power, let me back up a little bit. I'm sorry. So here's the issue. We've got power, and then we've got our interconnectivity. So we want to power two devices, and then we want to connect them together audio-wise. And remember, audio is not sound. Audio is not sound. So our power is going to be grounded no matter what. All of the negative, all the negative leads, they're all going to be connected together. Now here's where it gets interesting. Whenever I interconnect my audio between two devices, they're going to be grounded together, provided that one of the conductors is connected on both sides of the sleeve. They're going to be grounded as well. This introduces a ground loop. If I have another device that's powered by a battery, right? Well, its power is not going to be connected to the ground. It's going to be isolated. Now, here's the funny part, is that you really don't need to ground your interconnectivity if all the power is connected. But all of your cables are going to be grounded that you buy. You're going to ground it. There is a practice where you have a cable and you only ground one side. But that is a very specialized situation, one that you'll find mainly in professional studios that have a lot of rack setups. In fact, when you look at the racks themselves, with patch bays within the racks, you can have it configured so that all of the various little patch points, all of those jacks, are automatically grounded together as well. So your cables don't have to have a ground connector going through them. In other words, that negative conductor doesn't have to be, they don't have to be connected to each other. All of this is done to eliminate known ground loop issues for that studio, for those particular pieces of devices. Here's what I'm getting at. Probably what you're waiting for is, how do I solve my ground loop issues? What do I need to do to solve ground loop issues? Well, guess what? There really is no answer. That's probably why, if you've been searching for an answer on eliminating ground loops in books and across different YouTube videos, you have not been satisfied with what you found. And I'm here to tell you right now, the reason is because there really is no answer. It changes for every situation. When I packed up my studio, I had no ground loop issues. No unwanted noise was being introduced into my system. When I set everything up over here, bam, I had massive ground loop issues that I had to solve. And it was not because of my wiring, my residential wiring situation that I'm dealing with. It was because, inevitably, hey, there was no way I was going to label what everything was hooked up to at the old place. Like which power outlet strip that I was using for which wall warts that I was using for which devices, that kind of thing. So when I hooked everything up, I optimized things. I chose to kind of redo what I did to make things more optimal. And because I had a number of devices powered off the same power strip, caused a noise issue. Answer. Well, answers. I love these things, but they're expensive. These are called Opto Isolators. Inside of this, and again, this is why I keep stressing, audio is not sound. Inside of this is an LED, and that LED flashes according to the audio signal, the amplitude, if you will, the voltage level of it. On the other side of that LED is a photoresistor, the thing that a theremin operates off to change the pitch of that synthesizer. And it's the inverse of that LED, so it receives that voltage, that change in voltage, and sends it out this way. You get what I'm saying here? And it sounds beautiful. Now, power in does not equal power out. There's always a power loss. So yeah, there is going to be a little bit of a loss in the signal, but as long as we're not introducing noise, that's okay. We can amplify that signal. If there's no noise, we can always amplify that signal. We're not losing anything in the long run, and we're getting rid of all the noise. Now these are $10 a pop, so it's an expensive solution. But where it's necessary, but get this. I was using one of these for each of my Roland boutiques. Aside, I bought these battery packs to power my Roland boutiques to eliminate the noise issues, and they didn't work. Why? Because all the Rolands were all powered off the same thing, and that's where the ground loop was coming from. So I bought these, fixed the issue. But now here I am at my apartment, the new apartment. Same thing. I've got one of these on each of my 6 Roland boutiques, and I'm getting bad noise issues. I just pick one, I remove one from the JX03, noise issues go away. How do you teach that to somebody? You see what I'm saying? I'm like, oh, wow, okay, yeah, that's the kind of stuff that we're dealing with here. If you have a ground loop issue, what you need to do is you need to first find out where it's coming from. If you've got a mixer, mute all the tracks until it goes away. And then you found that where it's coming from. And then just go from there. Try powering it off of a different outlet if you're powering it off of an outlet strip. You know, try a different means. If you have to, get one of these. They help out. Now, real quick, we'll talk about direct boxes. I think every studio should have one of these. These are really cool because they have this ground loop as well. This ground loop actually ties back into safety, believe it or not. I think that these came about because people were being a little irresponsible on live stages with microphones and guitars. You'll hear about this all the time about singers getting shocked when they were playing a guitar and walking up and to their microphone and getting a big shock. And this is the other reason for grounding, which I didn't get into too much, and that is to keep all of your circuits at the same ground potential. Well, in this case, I don't know where the different powers are coming from. You know, we need more details on these situations to really understand why someone got shocked behind the microphone holding a guitar. But inevitably, their ground was at different potentials. And when that happens, when your grounds are not at the same potential, you can actually add voltage to more voltage, I think. And bad things can happen. So as a result to people doing stupid, unsafe things on the stage, people started having this ground lift issue to avoid ground loops. And yeah, it's again, it's okay. It's okay. So you say to yourself, wait a second, everything needs to be grounded, right? I'm doing something unsafe. So if you're concerned about that and not wanting to use this kind of thing because of that, no, it's okay. It's okay. So I think we'll have to wrap it up on that issue, but I just will say that like anytime you connect one of these connectors into a jack, you know, you're grounding whatever it is that you just connected to most of the time. And if they're using the same power, they're probably already grounded. That's another thing to understand. But the most important 2 things to take away from this is that grounding is primarily used for safety, and we as audio engineers can also use it to eliminate noise hums. And on that, you can enjoy this noise-free, with the exception of the cars going down the street over here, these wonderful noise-free sounds of nature. All right, YouTube, see you next time. Have a Being a synth punk can be cool, but when you become bored, you become a synth bully. Don't do that. Do what the synth nerds do. Read a book.